Marry me for 6 months.
Okay.
I love Friend.
Promise me she'll always know what a real family feels like.
Promise was only about raising my daughter. I had no idea it would lead me to another family.
The day Eleanor Whitmore asked me to marry her, I thought she had lost her mind. I had driven to the Whitmore ranch looking for work, nothing more. My own ranch was struggling after a long season of drought. Bills were piling up, and I needed every honest job I could find. The Whitmore Ranch was the largest property in the county, so I figured they might need another pair of hands. Instead, I walked straight into a crisis. Only a month had passed since the death of William Whitmore, the legendary rancher who had built one of the greatest cattle operations in Texas. His daughter, Eleanor Whitmore, had inherited everything, thousands of acres, hundreds of employees, and a legacy that seemed almost impossible to carry alone. She looked nothing like the confident businesswoman people described. She looked exhausted, worried, as if the weight of the entire ranch rested on her shoulders. When she invited me into her father's old office, I assumed we were going to discuss a job. Instead, she closed the door, took a deep breath, and placed a thick folder on the desk between us. "My father's will," she said quietly. She explained that William had included one final condition before his death, a condition almost no one knew about. To retain full ownership and voting control of the Whitmore Ranch during the 6-month transition period, the legal owner had to be married. If she remained unmarried, outside investors would immediately gain voting rights over the ranch's future. The board could force the sale of family land. Generations of hard work could disappear in a matter of weeks. I stared at her, trying to understand why she was telling me all of this. Then she looked directly into my eyes. There wasn't a trace of arrogance, only desperation. Finally, she said the words, "I'll never forget. Marry me for 6 months, then leave." For a moment, I honestly believed she was joking. I looked around the room expecting someone to laugh. Nobody did. The silence became almost unbearable. A wealthy ranch owner, a struggling single father, a marriage based entirely on a contract. Nothing about it made sense. I should have stood up. I should have thanked her for her honesty and walked away. Instead, I found myself thinking about my daughter, about my ranch, about promises I'd made years ago. Then I looked back at Eleanor. She wasn't asking for love. She wasn't asking for forever. She was asking for help. And somehow, against every bit of common sense I had, I heard myself say one word. "Okay." At that moment, neither of us realized that what was supposed to last only 180 days was about to change the rest of our lives forever. My name is Jacob Miller. I'm 42 years old, and if you had met me before that day, you probably would have described me with just one word: cowboy. Not because I wore a hat or rode horses, because ranching wasn't just my job, it was my entire life. Every morning before sunrise, I was already outside feeding horses, repairing fences, checking water tanks, and trying to keep my little ranch alive another day. It wasn't much. A weathered barn that creaked every time the wind picked up. A modest house my father had built decades earlier. A few horses, some cattle, an old pickup truck that had broken down so many times I knew every strange sound it could make. And bills, always bills. Some months I honestly wondered how I was going to make it through. But every evening when I drove back through the front gate, one little girl would come running across the yard as if I'd been gone for years. Emma, my daughter, 8 years old, the brightest part of every single day. Emma loved horses more than anything else in the world. She talked to them, sang to them, brushed them until their coats shined. Sometimes I joked that they listened to her better than they listened to me. She had the kindest heart I'd ever seen. If a newborn calf was frightened, Emma would sit beside it until it calmed down. If a horse was injured, she'd spend hours helping me care for it. She somehow believed every living creature deserved love. I often wondered where she learned that. Then I remembered Sarah, my wife, Emma's mother, the woman who made our little ranch feel like the happiest place on earth. She had a way of making even the hardest days seem lighter. No matter how tired I was, no matter how many problems waited outside. Walking through the front door and seeing Sarah smile always reminded me what really mattered. Then cancer took her away. Everything changed after that. The house became quieter, meals became shorter, laughter became rare. But the hardest part wasn't losing my wife. It was watching Emma lose her mother. Children grieve differently. They don't always cry. Sometimes they simply stop being children for a while. I watched Emma grow quieter. I watched her search every room as though she still expected Sarah to walk through the door. I watched her pretend to be brave because she thought I needed her to. Those were the moments that hurt the most. The night before Sarah passed away, the hospital room was almost silent. Emma had fallen asleep in a chair beside the window, holding her favorite stuffed horse. Sarah reached for my hand. She smiled the same beautiful smile that had made me fall in love with her years earlier. Then she whispered something I'll carry for the rest of my life. Never let Emma grow up without knowing what a real family feels like. I promised. At the time, I thought keeping that promise meant raising Emma the best I could. Teaching her right from wrong. Protecting her. Being both father and mother whenever I had to. I never imagined that promise might one day involve another family, another ranch, another woman, which was exactly why Eleanor's proposal felt impossible. A marriage built on paperwork. A home shared by strangers. 180 days with an expiration date already written into the contract. How could something that began with legal documents ever become a real family? The answer seemed obvious. It couldn't. As I drove home, after accepting Eleanor's proposal, Emma asked why I looked so serious. I smiled and told her everything was going to be all right. But deep inside, I believed this arrangement would remain exactly what it was meant to be. A business agreement. Nothing more. Because no matter how convincing the contract looked, I was certain one thing would never happen. No piece of paper could ever create the kind of family Sarah had asked me to protect. A week later, Eleanor and I were standing inside the county courthouse. No family, no celebration, no flowers, no music. Just a judge, 2 witnesses, a lawyer carrying a stack of papers, and 2 people pretending that getting married was simply another business transaction. Before we signed anything, Eleanor handed me a contract nearly as thick as my arm. "I think we should make everything perfectly clear," she said. I nodded. Honestly, I appreciated her honesty. The agreement was simple. Separate bedrooms, no romantic relationship, no interference in each other's personal lives, no expectations beyond what was necessary to satisfy the conditions of William Whitmore's will. And most importantly, exactly 180 days, not one day more. On the morning of day 181, the marriage would legally end. No arguments, no obligations, no broken promises. We both signed. The judge declared us husband and wife, and just like that, I became the husband of the richest ranch owner in the county. It didn't take long for the rumors to spread. By sunset, every diner, feed store, church parking lot, and livestock auction within 50 miles had its own version of the story. Some people claimed I had planned it all along. Others insisted I had married Eleanor for her fortune. A few even suggested I'd manipulated the entire situation from the beginning. People who had known me for years suddenly looked at me differently, not because I had changed, because money changes the way people see you. One afternoon while buying feed in town, I overheard two ranchers talking. He played that pretty well. I guess marrying a millionaire beats fixing fences. I wanted to tell them they were wrong. Instead, I loaded the feed into my truck and drove away. There was no point arguing with people who had already decided what to believe. One person, however, seemed especially convinced. Victor Kane, William Whitmore's former business associate, a wealthy investor who had expected to become much more than Eleanor's business partner. From the very beginning, Victor looked at me as if I were nothing more than a gold digger wearing cowboy boots. Every conversation with him felt like a test. Every smile felt fake. Every compliment sounded like an insult. He believed I had married Eleanor for money, and deep down, he was waiting for me to prove him right. Fortunately, not everyone saw things the same way. Emma certainly didn't. The first time she met Noah Whitmore, they barely exchanged 5 words. By the end of the afternoon, they were feeding carrots to horses together, as if they had known each other their entire lives. Children have a remarkable way of ignoring the walls adults build. Emma didn't see the son of a wealthy ranch owner. She saw another kid who liked horses. Noah didn't see the daughter of a struggling cowboy. He saw someone who smiled easily and treated every animal with kindness. Within days, they were inseparable. They explored the barns together, helped feed the horses every morning, competed to see who could brush thunder the fastest. Sometimes I'd catch them laughing so hard that even the ranch hands stopped working just to watch. Their friendship changed the atmosphere of the entire ranch. Employees smiled more. The house felt warmer. Even the horses seemed calmer. And then something happened that nobody expected, least of all me. One evening after dinner, Emma and Noah convinced Eleanor to join them outside. They wanted to show her a newborn foal. At first she hesitated. She always seemed buried beneath meetings, paperwork, and responsibilities. But eventually she gave in. I watched from the porch as the 3 of them walked toward the pasture. Emma held one of Eleanor's hands. Noah held the other. The children were talking non-stop. Eleanor wasn't saying much. Then she laughed. Not the polite smile she gave investors, not the careful expression she wore during business meetings. A real laugh, warm, natural, free, the kind of laugh that reached her eyes. For a moment she looked less like the powerful owner of the Whitmore Ranch, and more like a woman who had finally remembered what happiness sounded like. Standing there, I realized something. Our marriage might have started as a contract, but something inside that house had already begun changing, and none of us, not even Eleanor, seemed ready to admit it. The funny thing about 6 months is that they sound much longer on paper than they feel in real life. The first few weeks passed exactly as our contract had predicted. Eleanor handled the business side of the Whitmore Ranch. I took care of the horses, the cattle, and whatever needed fixing. We were polite, respectful, professional, nothing more. Separate bedrooms, separate routines, separate lives. At least that was the plan. But ranches have a way of ignoring plans. Every morning before sunrise, I was already outside working alongside the ranch hands. Broken fences, sick calves, damaged water lines. It didn't matter what the problem was. If I could fix it, I did. Not because someone asked me to, because that's how I was raised. It didn't take long for the employees to notice. At first, most of them treated me like the temporary husband everyone expected to disappear in 6 months. They were polite, careful, a little distant. Then one afternoon, an irrigation pump failed just before a heat wave. Everyone expected us to call a repair company. Instead, I spent 4 hours covered in mud beside 2 ranch mechanics until we got it running again. The next morning, people greeted me differently, not because I was Eleanor's husband, because I worked beside them instead of above them. Over the following months, that became my routine. If someone needed help loading hay, I helped. If a horse escaped, I saddled up. If a storm damaged fences during the night, I was already repairing them before breakfast. I never thought twice about it. To me, work was simply work. Apparently, Eleanor noticed. One evening, while reviewing paperwork in her office, she looked up and asked a question that caught me off guard. "Why don't you ever complain?" I laughed. "About what?" She gestured toward the window. "The work. The long days. The broken equipment. The endless problems." I shrugged. Complaining never fixed a fence. For a second, she simply stared at me. Then she smiled, a small smile, but a real one. What she didn't know was that none of those things felt difficult compared to losing Sarah. After you've buried the person you love most, a broken tractor doesn't seem like much of a problem. Money never became part of our conversations either. The contract guaranteed that I'd receive compensation for helping protect the ranch. I never asked about it, never negotiated, never demanded anything. Truthfully, most of my attention was somewhere else. Emma and Noah. Somehow those 2 children managed to accomplish what no adult could. Within a couple of months, they acted less like friends and more like brother and sister. They raced horses across the pastures, built imaginary forts inside the old barn, argued over who got to feed the newest foal first, then forgot they were arguing 5 minutes later. Every evening they'd burst through the front door covered in dust, laughing so hard they could barely breathe. The house changed because of them. Dinner became noisy. The long dining table that once felt cold suddenly filled with stories, laughter, and harmless arguments about whose horse ran faster. Sometimes Emma would convince Noah to help bake biscuits. Sometimes Noah insisted Emma needed riding lessons from him, even though she was probably the better rider. Watching them together reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. What a family sounds like. Not perfect, not quiet, alive. One Saturday afternoon, the 4 of us rode horseback to a hill overlooking the entire Whitmore Ranch. The children raced ahead while Eleanor and I followed at a slower pace. Neither of us spoke much. We simply watched Emma and Noah laughing beneath the golden Texas sky. "They look happy," Eleanor said softly. "They are. So do you." That answer surprised me. I hadn't realized it myself. Somewhere along the way, this place had started feeling less like an obligation and more like home. I glanced toward Eleanor. The wind moved a loose strand of hair across her face as she smiled while watching the children. For just a moment, she wasn't thinking about contracts or board meetings or inheritance. She was simply enjoying being with them. Unfortunately, we weren't the only ones noticing the change. From the porch of the main house, Victor Kane watched us through the windows. His expression wasn't one of curiosity or concern. It was something much darker, because for the first time since our marriage began, he realized Eleanor Whitmore was no longer pretending. She was beginning to fall in love, and that was something Victor Kane would never allow to happen. By the time our marriage reached the 5th month, the ranch no longer felt like a place where 2 strangers happened to live under the same roof. It felt like home. Maybe that was exactly what frightened Victor Kane. The closer Eleanor and I became, not through romance but through trust, the more desperate he grew. At first, his attacks were subtle. He whispered rumors around town. According to him, I had planned everything from the beginning. A poor cowboy marrying the richest ranch owner in the county. People love stories like that, especially when they aren't true. Soon those whispers became conversations. Conversations became accusations. I started noticing strangers staring at me differently whenever I walked into the feed store or the diner. One afternoon I overheard someone say, "Just wait until those 6 months are over. He'll leave with half the ranch." I kept walking. People are free to believe whatever they want. The truth doesn't change because someone invents a better story. Victor wasn't satisfied with gossip alone. He wanted proof, or rather, he wanted to create it. One evening, Eleanor called me into her office. She looked worried. Someone had anonymously mailed copies of financial documents to the board of directors. According to those papers, I had secretly negotiated payments far larger than the amount written in our marriage agreement. There were supposed bank transfers, private letters, even what appeared to be my signature on several documents. At first glance, everything looked authentic. Too authentic. But years earlier, before returning to ranch life, I had spent nearly a decade serving as a Texas Ranger. Investigating fraud had taught me one important lesson. The best forgeries always contain one small mistake. I asked Eleanor for the documents. Instead of reading the numbers, I studied the details, the signatures, the paper, the dates, the ink. Within minutes, something caught my attention. One letter in my signature had been copied from an old property registration I'd signed years before. Perfectly copied, too perfectly, because I had changed the way I signed my name nearly 4 years earlier after injuring my wrist. Whoever forged the documents had copied an outdated signature without realizing it. That single mistake unraveled everything. I requested access to the original financial records. The board reluctantly agreed. By the following afternoon, the truth became impossible to ignore. Several documents had been inserted into official files only days earlier. Paperwork had been altered. Digital records had been accessed after business hours. Someone inside the ranch administration was helping Victor. The investigation moved quickly after that. A bookkeeper admitted receiving money in exchange for changing filing dates. An assistant confessed that Victor had instructed her to place forged documents where board members would eventually find them. Little by little, the entire scheme came into focus. Victor wasn't trying to prove our marriage was fake. He was trying to convince the board that I had manipulated Eleanor for financial gain. If he succeeded, the marriage could be declared fraudulent. The 6-month requirement in William Whitmore's will might become invalid. The board could take control of the ranch. Exactly what Victor had wanted from the very beginning. When Eleanor realized how close she had come to losing everything, she looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry." I shook my head. "You don't owe me an apology. This isn't your fault." She lowered her eyes. I almost believed him. I smiled gently. That's what good liars count on. For the first time since all of this began, she reached for my hand. Not because the contract required it, because she trusted me. At that moment I understood something. Victor wasn't fighting for the ranch anymore. He was fighting against the family we had accidentally become. Then I glanced at the calendar hanging beside Eleanor's desk. Only 2 days remained before our contract expired. 178 days were behind us. 2 remained. And somehow, those 48 hours suddenly felt like the most important of my life. Day 179 arrived faster than I ever imagined. The final meeting of the Whitmore Ranch Board was held that morning inside the same conference room where Eleanor had first asked me to marry her. 6 months earlier, I had walked into that room looking for work. Now I walked in as the man everyone was waiting to judge. Every board member was present. The ranch attorneys, financial advisors, county officials, even employees gathered outside the room, hoping to hear what would happen. Victor Kane arrived wearing the same confident smile he'd carried from the beginning. He still believed he could destroy everything at the very last moment. The meeting began with the forged documents he had spent weeks preparing. But this time, things were different. The independent investigators presented their findings before Victor had the chance to speak. Every forged signature, every altered bank record, every false financial statement, every payment made to the employees he had bribed. One witness after another stood and told the truth. The bookkeeper confessed. The administrative assistant admitted changing official records. A handwriting expert explained why the signatures were fake. Even the bank confirmed that the accounts Victor claimed existed had never been opened. Piece by piece, his entire plan collapsed. For the first time since I met him, Victor looked afraid. He tried to interrupt. He accused everyone of conspiring against him. But facts don't argue. They simply exist. When the chairman finally called for a vote, the decision was unanimous. The marriage agreement remained legally valid. William Whitmore's final wishes had been honored. Eleanor retained complete ownership of the Whitmore Ranch. Victor Kane was permanently removed from every position he held within the company, and the evidence against him was immediately turned over to the county sheriff for criminal investigation. Just like that. The ranch was safe. The employees kept their jobs. William Whitmore's legacy survived. Everyone congratulated Eleanor. Several ranch hands shook my hand. Even board members who had doubted me apologized before leaving. By every measure, we had won. But as strange as it sounds, victory didn't feel like victory, because while everyone else celebrated, I couldn't stop thinking about the calendar. Tomorrow would be day 180. The contract would end, exactly as promised. That evening, after the ranch had grown quiet, I walked upstairs to the guest room that had been mine for 6 months. I opened the old leather suitcase I'd brought on my first day. Most of my belongings fit inside within minutes. A few shirts, my boots, Sarah's wedding photograph that I always carried, Emma's favorite storybook, nothing more. The room looked exactly as it had before I arrived, as though I had never lived there at all. Outside, my old pickup truck waited beside the porch. I loaded the suitcase into the bed of the truck. Then I returned to the house one last time. Emma was sitting on the front steps. She already knew. Children always know. She looked at me with eyes full of tears. "Do we really have to leave?" I knelt beside her. I gave my word. She nodded, trying to be brave. But before she could answer, another small voice spoke behind us. Noah. He had been standing in the doorway the entire time. His eyes were red from crying. "You promised we'd finish teaching Thunder to jump the creek." I forced a smile. "I know. You can't leave." Every word felt heavier than the last. The two children stood together on the porch, neither of them trying to hide their tears anymore. Looking at them hurt more than I expected. 6 months earlier, they had been strangers. Now they looked like brother and sister. For a moment, I almost forgot why I had agreed to this marriage in the first place. Then I remembered my promise. A deal is a deal. I closed the tailgate of my truck, took one last look at the Whitmore Ranch, the home that had somehow become part of me. I climbed into the driver's seat and reached for the keys. I told myself it was the right thing to do, that I'd kept my word, that some stories are only meant to last 180 days. I started the engine, shifted into gear, and just as I was about to pull away, I heard someone calling my name. "Jacob." I looked into the rearview mirror. Eleanor was running across the front yard toward my truck. For the first time since I'd met her, she wasn't running to save the ranch. She was running to stop me from leaving. I stopped the truck before I had driven more than a few yards. Eleanor was running across the front lawn, her hair moving in the wind, tears streaming down her face. For 6 months, I had watched her remain composed through board meetings, financial disasters, lawsuits, and everything Victor Kane had thrown at her. I had never seen her like this, completely vulnerable, completely honest. I stepped out of the truck. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The engine continued idling behind me, while the evening breeze carried the familiar sounds of the ranch. The horses, the distant cattle, the wooden windmill turning slowly against the Texas sky. Eleanor finally caught her breath. Her eyes searched mine, as though she was afraid I would disappear before she could find the right words. Then, almost in a whisper, she said the sentence that changed everything. "Please, don't leave." My heart wanted to answer immediately. My promise wouldn't let me. I lowered my eyes for a moment before looking back at her. "The contract is over." She nodded slowly. "I know." A small smile appeared through her tears. "Maybe the contract is." She took one careful step closer. "But what we became isn't." Those words hit me harder than anything else she'd ever said, because she was right. Somewhere between fixing fences together, sharing quiet dinners, watching sunsets after long days, helping Noah with his grief, listening to Emma laugh through the hallways, somewhere along the way, the contract had quietly stopped being the reason we stayed together. Neither of us had noticed exactly when it happened. It simply happened. I looked toward the porch. Emma and Noah were standing side by side, watching us. Emma suddenly ran toward Noah and threw her arms around him. He hugged her back without hesitation. The two of them were smiling through tears. Neither child seemed worried anymore, almost as if they already knew how this story was supposed to end. I realized something then. For months I had been telling myself I was protecting Emma by keeping my promise. But the promise Sarah asked me to keep had never been about honoring a contract. It had been about giving Emma a real family. Standing there, watching her laugh with Noah, watching Eleanor look at both children with the same love, I finally understood. She already had one. And so did I. I walked the few remaining steps toward Eleanor. Without saying another word, I wrapped my arms around her. She buried her face against my shoulder and quietly laughed through her tears. For the first time since William Whitmore's death, for the first time since Sarah left this world, neither of us felt alone anymore. A few minutes later, Emma appeared holding the reins of 4 horses. "Dad?" She smiled. "I don't think we're leaving anymore." I laughed. "No, I don't think we are." The 4 of us rode together across the Whitmore Ranch as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the Texas hills. Emma and Noah raced ahead, laughing as their horses galloped through the open pasture. Eleanor rode beside me, not because a contract required it, because that was exactly where she wanted to be. The golden light covered the fields William Whitmore had loved. A gentle breeze moved through the tall grass. For the first time in a very long while, everything felt exactly where it belonged. As I watched the children disappear over the next hill, I thought back to the day Eleanor first made her unbelievable proposal. At the time, I believed I was agreeing to 6 months of pretending. I couldn't have been more wrong. I thought I was marrying her for 6 months. I never realized I was finding my family for the rest of my life. If you had been in Jacob's place, would you have accepted a 6-month marriage? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about family, second chances, love, and cowboys who never give up. Subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story.